Good morning, everyone. We're so happy to have you here and on the big award shows, like at the Academy Awards and the other big award shows. The biggest stars sometimes are not available in person, so you have to show them remotely. So we have the pleasure today. Natalie Lyons is the director of the Adoption National Resource Center, and she isn't able to be with us today. And you know, we're getting a little feedback, I think. What we wanted to do was have Natalie, she really wanted to be here. It's hard for her not to be here. She wanted to give you a welcome in person. So without further ado, here is the lovely Natalie Lyons.
Well, first, I'd like to thank the Academy for this wonderful award. Wait a second. Wrong meeting. I just want you all to feel like stars, even though this is not the Academy Award and I can't be with you today. Sometimes storms of life come up and prevent us from doing what we plan on doing, but we sure hope at the Resource Center for Adoption that you guys are feeling like kings and queens and the stars that you are. It's a very important meeting that we're going to be having this next week, and we want you all just to be able to be comfortable, gather the information that you need, and network with your peers. Ingrid Parks is there, and she's going to give you all of the wonderful information that's in your packet, and I know that Heidi's going to go over the agenda for the day. But I wanted just to do a special thing for you, and I'm hoping that on your tables there is an easy button. Does everybody see that easy button on their table? Okay, so this easy button,
that was easy,
is to not say that your job is easy, but hopefully it's going to remind you of how far you've come. So when you're there and you're getting this information and you might feel a little bit overwhelmed, go ahead and press the easy button. You might not be where you want to be, but thank God you're not where you used to be. With that, I just want to say welcome to the Ritz-Carlton in Pentagon City. Though I'm not with you there, and Bonnie, know that my thoughts are with you there, and I know you're going to have a terrific meeting, and welcome. Heidi, back to you.
Thank you, Natalie. She is a star, isn't she? Okay, so we're taping this. So what I'd like all of you to... Okay, I'm going to really date myself here. Do you guys remember the show, The Dating Game? You remember that? Remember you used to blow a kiss? So I want you guys to... We're going to tape this. You'll see it later. So I want you to look at one of the cameras, and I want, on the count of 3, let me model the behavior first. It's like this. It goes... Okay? So we're going to blow a kiss to Natalie. So ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, great, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, now, just for our, really, we all know that really, in real life, we all work for Ingrid Parks. I mean, really, she really runs the whole show, right? Am I right? So anyway, she's lovely, she's capable, she's talented. She's going to tell us everything we need to know about the next 2 days, okay? Thank you, Ingrid.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending Making Connections in Child Welfare, the 2010 Policy to Practice Dialogue. I am project manager for the National Resource Center for Adoption. I work under Natalie, and we have some of our fine staff here helping put on this shindig for you all. I'd like to go over what's in your meeting packets. You'll notice the conference booklet on top, which covers all the activities going on during our 2 days together. There's a folder inside which contains the PowerPoint presentations for the plenary sessions, and it's separated in each pocket by day 1 and day 2. You also have in there a pad of paper for taking notes. For those of you that are sponsor participants, you have travel and reimbursement guidelines and a reimbursement form for claiming those expenses that you have to pay for up front. And then we also have a DC destination guide, which features activities that might be of interest in the area that are taking place during your time here in DC. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heidi. We hope you enjoy the meeting, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Natalie. My name's Heidi Staples, and I'm the Federal Project Officer for the National Resource Center for Adoption, also with Adopt Us Kids, and also the liaison for the state adoption managers. So welcome to all of you. If I don't know you already, I hope I get to meet you in the next couple of days, so please come up and say hello, and really hope you get to meet a lot of fun and interesting people here. The National Resource Center for Adoption always does a wonderful job of organizing and of running these events. And so could everyone who's here in the room, they're probably all out working, but everyone who's here with the NRC for Adoption, could you either stand up or wave your arms wildly, please, if you're at the cameras? Thank you. On behalf of the Children's Bureau, I want to issue you a warm welcome to the Policy to Practice meeting. And we're going to start by introducing all of you who are in the room. And we're very happy. We have 47 states, the Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C. here represented. So we think it's an amazing turnout. So let's give all of you a hand for coming. We'd like all the folks in the room who are the state foster care managers or their representatives to stand up so we know who you are. Okay, glad to have you here. All the state adoption managers or their representatives, if you could stand up and wave wildly. And then all the state in-home folks who are here, or your representatives, or anyone else who's here from a state who came along for the ride, please stand up. And we have our very talented and esteemed members of the Training and Technical Assistance Network. Would all of you please stand up? Welcome. And then we have our good friends from the Ad Council are here. Ad Council folks, can you stand up? And did I miss anyone? Is anyone who I didn't say anything, please stand up? Okay. Huh? Oh, well, I'm getting to them. Okay. I'm sorry. I forgot the feds. Okay, we want you to meet all of our federal staff. Would all of our federal staff please stand up and wave wildly? You'll be hearing from many of these folks over the next couple of days, and we're just all excited that you're here. We want to welcome you to the nation's capital. We're sorry there's a bit of rain out there. We hope you like this hotel. This hotel is just an 8-minute walk from the Pentagon Memorial, so if the weather clears, I hope that you do get a chance to walk over there and you get directions from the front desk about that. It's really something to see. We decided to name this year's meeting Making Connections in Child Welfare, and we thought about that because we wanted this to be a working meeting with our partnership that exists between our federal and state entities to carry out this complex, challenging, and constantly changing landscape that is child welfare services. And calling it Making Connections in Child Welfare, we really were focusing on 3 things. One is we really want to talk about and understand and help you understand how to implement fostering connections legislation. So we thought it was important to highlight that, and so that you could make the connections with both the values and understanding the policies and regulations that go along with that, as well as other important federal updates. We wanted to make those important connections between you and the federal staff. We want to have relationships with you. We want to know what's going on in the states. We want to know what's going on in the field, and we want to feel like we have a conversation with you. And we also want to have relationships between you and the Training and Technical Assistance Network. And there's never been really a better time for you to have access to the quality training and technical assistance that's available to your states at no cost to you to help you be the best you can be in all of child welfare services. So we do want you to make sure that you meet all of our training and technical assistance experts that are here. We're very proud of them. They do excellent work, and they're going to be running a lot of the workshops over the next 2 days. We also want you to make connections with each other. We feel that there's a lot of important peer-to-peer learning and relationships that go on, and we hope to highlight in the workshops over the next couple of days some of the excellent, successful work that's going on in states with specific examples, and we always pay a lot of attention to evaluations, and we always know that that's important to you to hear about. So towards that end, we have a variety of plenaries and workshops for you to choose from over the next couple of days with a rich assortment of topics that we hope you will find interesting. And we're going to hear from our commissioner this morning up until 10, then we'll take a break. I'm going to just go through our agenda, but I do want to say that we have a very tight agenda over the next couple of days. We packed as much in as we could, and so we are going to respect you and your time by starting on time, ending on time, and we're going to move through our day. And we ask that you cooperate with us by being to your workshop or to the meetings on time and to be attentive. And the presenters have worked very hard on their presentations, so we do want to do that. So we'll ask you to stick closely to the schedule. We'll hear from our commissioner till 10. We'll take a break. And then we'll have our first series of workshops. And then Adopt Us Kids will be sponsoring a luncheon in the next room, as Ingrid said. And you'll be able to see the Adoption Excellence Awards winners. They're very excited, and we're excited to have them here. And then you're going to get to see the newest round of public service announcements that the Ad Council has produced. They're just outstanding, and this year we're targeting homes for siblings. So we know that that will be useful to you in your work, and we're real excited about that. After lunch, we'll all be back here at 1:15 for the Policy Division's presentation on fostering connections. So we'll want to be right on time for that, and we just can't wait to hear from Policy about that. And then we'll have our next series of workshops, and then we'll stop for the day. But oh no, we're not done. The National Association of State Adoption Managers will be having their executive meeting, and then from 6 to 8, we'll be having that reception. All the managers are welcome. It's in the same room where you're going to have lunch, and that is co-sponsored by the NRCs for Adoption, Permanency and Family Connections, and the In-Home Services NRC. So we are appreciative of them sponsoring that reception, again, so you can all get to know each other and form those important relationships. And then tomorrow morning, we'll start promptly again at 8:30, and we'll have the same setup with breakfast an hour before. So that's how we look for today. And now, in just a second, I'm going to introduce our Commissioner, Brian Samuels. It's my pleasure to tell you just a little bit about him. He comes to us from the great state of Illinois, where he served as Chief of Staff for the Chicago Public Schools, as well as the Director of the Illinois Department of Children and Family Services. Prior to these positions, Mr. Samuels taught at the University of Chicago School of Social Services Administration, while also providing technical assistance to state and local governments to improve human service delivery to vulnerable populations. I think you'll find that his personal story, as well as his professional journey, is poignant. I certainly did, and I'm just so appreciative that he could be with us this morning to share his thoughts and perspectives. So I give you Commissioner Brian Samuels.
Thank you, Heidi, and good morning. So, needless to say, we are all very pleased that you are here today. You play a really critical role in the way the child welfare system works and doesn't work at times, but mostly that it works. And so we're glad you're here. We're excited about the time you're going to spend together. I would echo Heidi's comments that this is as much an opportunity to learn about the facts and figures of what's going on in the child welfare system as it is to collaborate with one another. I think as you move forward in the day, you will see some more data. So you'll see the latest AFCARS data, which will provide some real insight into the progress that we're making and the impact that you're having on the child welfare system. So that'll be exciting. At the same time, I think there are also some really interesting narratives that come out of the data, and it's worth a little bit of time thinking about that. So I want to focus a little bit on the narrative. In child welfare, I've been in child welfare for a long time, a whole 7 years. So let me take a second and explain that. So I was the state child welfare director in the state of Illinois from 2003 to 2007. But prior to 2003, I had not worked in child welfare. So many of you who come from other fields who have found this as a place of your calling or a place that you've just discovered but you have a serious commitment to it, I too had the same opportunity just 7 years ago. And when I took over the State Child Welfare Agency, there was a narrative in this country that I think is important and is one that we all ought to consider, which is in both inside the child welfare system and outside the child welfare system, there really is this sense that the child welfare system is too black, too old, too big, kids stay too long, kids wait too long. So there's a narrative that says that the child welfare system is defined by what's wrong in the child welfare system and not by what is right in the child welfare system. I remember when I interviewed for the job with the governor, the first question he asked me was, "So Brian, how do we keep the child welfare system out of the newspaper?" Obviously, I gave him a brilliant answer. I remember the second day on the job, I got in a car and drove down to Springfield to testify on the budget. And the first question was, why aren't you asking for more money for residential treatment? Because clearly you have children who have more needs today than they had before. Said differently, you've got a bunch of crazy kids, and so you need to be placing them all in residential, and therefore you should be asking for more money, not less money, right? So I did that one, and then I moved from the House over to the Senate. And when I got to the Senate, the question was, well, what are you going to do about black kids, right? You're black, you got a lot of black kids in the system, what are you going to do about black kids? Then I got back in a car, and I drove back to Chicago the next day, and I did interviews with both the editorial boards of the Tribune and the Sun-Times. And when I did the interview with the Tribune, the first 10 questions were about race. And the first question was, so you've spoken about this disproportionality thing, right? How do you know that the number of blacks in the system is disproportionate? To which I answered, well, that's a mathematical question, so that's easy to explain. So I explained that African Americans make up 11% of the overall population, or 18% of the child population. In the child welfare system in Illinois, they represent 44% of the kids. So 18% versus 44% by definition is disproportionate. I don't know how much time you spent in the editorial boards of any newspaper. Snarky answers like that don't go very far. So then they came back with the question of, but how do you know that these particular children, that each one of these 44%, how do you know that these particular children don't need to be here? I said, well, the alternative, if you look at the numbers, would be to suggest then that if this many children need to be there, then it probably implies that we're not taking in enough of the other kids. They didn't like that answer either. But the point was that they were fixated on this idea that the child welfare system is in part defined by disproportionality. And as a person of color, I must have some overarching commitment to changing that. And if I did, it didn't really matter to them. They just wanted to be able to report on it, that I either was yay for getting black kids out of the system, which indicts the last administration because they didn't, or they wanted to be able to tell the story that he's black but he's not planning on getting the black kids out of the system, which would imply that I really probably shouldn't have the job because I haven't been there very long and I don't know what's going on. right? So I'm saying all this stuff that there's a narrative in the child welfare system. And the question is for you today, and the question for folks going forward is that the same narrative today? Is the narrative that folks have the narrative that you want? Is the narrative that folks have the narrative that I want? And if it isn't, what do we do about it? What is the narrative? So there's a lot of narrative change in the numbers. That's the exciting part. The work that you've done and others have done provide a real launching pad for re-engaging the community around what the child welfare system does and doesn't do well, what children it takes into care and which ones it doesn't, and ultimately the contribution that each and every one of you make to actually making the society that we live in a better place, not a worse place. So tomorrow you'll learn more and you'll get some more updates on the latest data from AFCARS, but in the big picture, there's some really exciting numbers when you look back to 1998 or so. So all of you know that the big change in child welfare, the biggest change in child welfare, took place in 1997 when ASFA was passed. And that was really done in the context of this larger narrative, right? So the child welfare system had grown substantially in the prior 7 years. The federal government looked at that number and said, boy, that number, if it keeps moving in that direction, is unsustainable. We have to change the policies to change the direction of those numbers. So in Illinois, when I was a college intern in 1990, there were 12,000 children in the system. By 1997, 7 years later, there were 51,000 kids in the system. So there was a dramatic increase. And that was replicated in almost every state in this country. So the numbers were skyrocketing, and the idea was, boy, there must be something wrong here, and there must be a set of interventions that we ought to engage in, right? And so big change starts to happen in 1997 with changes in the Congress, and then that has a ripple effect on the changes inside the child welfare system. So in Illinois, that number went from, in 1997, 51,000 children in care, down to 23,000 children in care by 2003. So in a short 6-year period of time, we went from 51,000 down to 23,000. So dramatic reduction. So just as large as the increase was, there was almost the same kind of reduction. And while that hasn't exactly been replicated nationwide, the numbers are still very encouraging. If you look at the system today versus 1998, in 1998, there were 560,000 children in the system. 560. Today, there are 420. So there are 140,000 fewer children in the system. Give yourself a hand. So that's a 25% reduction in less than 11 years. That's a huge accomplishment. That's part of the narrative. It's not today, but it could be, right? Let's talk about a couple of the other ones. So, disproportionality, right? Not evenly distributed throughout the country. But if you look at the numbers today versus 1998, what you'd see is that in 1998, there were 240,000 African American children in the system. They made up about 45% of the entire population. Today, that number is almost half. So today, the number is 127,000. So we went from 240,000 to 127,000 in just 11 years. Huge change. So on average, that means that African Americans make up about 30% of the population. Significant decline. Another encouraging number is in some respects, some might not agree with this, but I would argue another encouraging number is the number related to Hispanics. Because in this country, the largest growing population, in some respects, the only growing population in this country by ethnicity is Hispanics, right? And since 1998, the overall number of Hispanics in the country has grown by about 30% or so, depending on how you count. And there's been some growth in the child welfare system, so there are 1,500 more kids in the system who are Hispanic this year than there were 11 years ago. 1,500. So that number's stayed almost constant for the last 11 years, while the population overall has grown dramatically. In Illinois, the Hispanic population was 5% in 1990 when I was an intern in the governor's office. And by the time I left, the Hispanic population was 5%. So there was 5% way back in 1990. It was 5% when I left in 2007. So no growth there, right? So two of the narratives no longer are true, right? That there are way too many kids in the system. We got 25 fewer kids. Way too many black kids in the system. We got half as many black kids in the system. Way too many kids waiting to leave the system. Back in 98, there were about 125 to 130,000 kids who were waiting to be adopted. And today that number is closer to about 110, 115. So each year that number's gone down too. Again, big credit to you. Important work that you're doing. Last number I'll point out would be the number of kids aging out of the system, because that's an important narrative, right? That's a driving force behind much of the reform that's happened in fostering connections. As you know, in fostering connections, they address issues like educational stability, really being concerned about those kids who are aging out that don't graduate from high school, right? Fostering connections expands the guardianship assistance program to slow the number of kids who age out of the system. Fostering connections provides states the option of going from 18 to 21. Good news is on Friday, California's governor signed into law an extension to cover kids to 21. Right? So kids aging out of the system, really important narrative. Everybody is panicked about, concerned about the numbers aging out of the system. What if I told you, not to minimize it, but what if I told you that the actual number of children exiting the system overall, if you take all the kids who left last year and you ask how many of them left through aging out of the system, right? If I told you it was 7%, would you believe me? If you just listened to the narrative, would you believe it's 7%? No, you wouldn't. It is. Wow. So we are a system and a society that's driven by a narrative. We take all of the bad numbers, we add them up together, we indict an institution, and we say that's the story. Well, in 2010, the story in the child welfare system has changed. And what we have to do is get our arms around what's the new narrative? What is it? What's the story that we want to tell that's different? And how do you, in your role, take the opportunity to focus folks towards that different narrative, that different story, that different angle, because you're in a different place? Now, there'll be some folks that'll say to you, well, don't change the narrative, right? Because in part, we've used that narrative to get our job done, right? So if you're a state child welfare director, you're not excited about changing that narrative because in part, that's what you use to squeeze the legislature in tough times to give you a little more money or to cut a little less money, right? or if you're working in the residential treatment area, you don't want folks to know that the narrative might change, because that would suggest to you, right, that you've got to reconcile your stories that there are all those bad kids out there that need your residential treatment, right? And so I understand that the narrative today works for many people, and I don't doubt that at times it works for you. But the consequence of maintaining the same narrative while we make these significant improvements is that we're measured by our deficits and not by our strengths. The folks in the room today represent a strength of the child welfare system. You ought not to be confused about that, and you ought not let others be confused about that. The contribution you make to children and families is absolutely critical. Don't run from that. Don't be afraid to recognize that the progress the system's made and the contribution that you make is a given, right? You don't have to give that back. Even if you wake up tomorrow and, just like the governor said, there's a child welfare system story on the front page, it doesn't change your accomplishment. It doesn't reduce the amount of effort that you've put in. It doesn't change the nature of the relationships that you have with the folks who you interact with every day. And it doesn't change the children that you've committed yourself to making a difference for. So I think we can tell a different story. The numbers certainly tell a different story. And while it represents an adjustment for all of us, that adjustment, while in the short term may make our jobs a little harder, in the end, it helps folks understand the real work of the day. So, what are the other possible storylines? What are the other possible directions? How do you think about adoption in the context of a different storyline or a different narrative? It seems to me that a critical characteristic of that is to be able to articulate that when adoption is needed, you're better at it today than you ever were. So if you're a 10-year-old child in the system today, if you're a 10-year-old child in the system today, you have a 50% better chance of being adopted today than if you had been in the system just 11 years ago. If you're a 12 or a 13-year-old in the system today, a 12 or a 13-year-old in a system today, as hard as it is to move that population towards adoption, if you're that age today, you have a 65% better chance of being adopted today than you did 11 years ago. That's about your efficacy, right? That's about your skill and talent. That's about your ability to recognize the needs of a child and the willingness of adoptive parents, and to convert that relationship into something that is long-term and permanent. So you don't have to run very far from the bad narrative to get to a narrative that really does encapsulate the large and significant contribution that you make to the field. For the folks that are concerned about the narrative around children aging out of the system, right? And the concern that when they leave the system, they have really bad outcomes. They do have bad outcomes. No doubt about it. No way to run from. But you could make the argument that the solution to reducing the impact of children aging out of the system is making sure that they don't age out. Right? It is to move upstream and to say, actually, we know a lot about these kids much earlier in the process. If we did something earlier, further upstream, we wouldn't have to worry about the downstream. And that work begins with that 10-year-old that I described earlier, or the 12 or 13-year-old. When you look at the data very carefully, what you see is, I think one of the real challenges we have is that you have a population of children that if you go from age 0 to age 18, and you look at the number of children who enter the system, the highest percentage of children enter within the first year, about 16%. If you look at each year after that, right? So 16% enter in 2000, over here. If you then say, how many children before their first and second birthdays leave the system? So in 2001 and then in 2002, what you see is about half. So even with the youngest children, we're only able to move half. So that's an important stake in the ground. On the other side of the age range, if you look at the 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, there are just as many 16 and 17-year-olds entering the system as there are 3 and 4-year-olds. So the number is actually like a U shape. So it's really high before the age of 1. It declines to about 4% at the age of 9, and then it goes back up to about 7% for 15, 16-year-olds. So you have this U-shaped curve, right? And so the real work, I think, the real work going forward for kids aging out of the system is really to see those 10, 11, 12-year-olds when they enter the system and say up front that we know this will be difficult. But we know how to do this. As I indicated, we're 65% better at it today than we were 11 years ago. So we don't run from the emancipation. We don't run from the kids aging out of the system. We don't duck that. What we say is, everybody who sees that number and is concerned about it, look to the 10-year-olds. Because we know how to do this. We do it 50% better for 10-year-olds today. Now, if you could double that number in the next 10 years, you'd have a significant impact on the number of children who age out. Because remember, only 8% leave that way. So there's a narrative here, and it's about competency, it's about commitment, it's about being effective, it is about being focused, and it is about making a significant contribution to the larger society. There was this story in Illinois when I took over that there was a significant problem with the children who remained in the system because we had that significant decline. So we went from that 51,000 down to 23,000. And the narrative was, so the kids who remain, the young people who remain in the system, they have serious problems. And you need every single residential treatment bed you can get because every one of them needs it. I remember going in and meeting the Honorable Mayor Daley. You know, when I first got the job, within the first week or so, we reached out to his office. About 6 months ago, they squeezed me in for 15 minutes. So I go into the mayor, and before I could sit down, he said, "What are you going to do about all those kids? What are you going to do with all those kids?" I said, "Well, all of what kids?" He said, "All those crazy kids you got in your system, because you know half of them go to the Chicago public schools." I said, "Well, Mayor Daley, the numbers don't support that." I said, "I was just looking at the numbers the other day, and it says in a system that has about 500,000 children attending school, there are only about 3,500 kids in foster care." He said, "Well, then if those aren't your kids, they ought to be." But setting aside his diplomacy, he had a genuine concern for the instability that exists within many families. He had a genuine concern about the level of dysfunction within some families. And he had a legitimate concern that as the overall population declined in the foster care system, there was a concentration of children who needed more help. And my experience in Illinois is, yes, those young people need more help, but that the help that they need is not nearly as great as folks think it is. So the best example was I got into this fight with a particular residential treatment provider, and it was very public and very ugly, but at the end of the day, what we ended up doing was closing that program. And almost everybody who had worked in the system or related to the system said that we should not do that we should not close them down. And part of the rationale for not closing them was, well, how do you know that the other residential treatment programs aren't as bad? So my answer to that was, I don't know that. Let me finish closing this one. There's a silver lining in there. The silver lining in there was we did a series of interviews with each of the 150 so young people that were in the program. Present in those interviews were their caseworker, someone from my administration, the guardian ad litem, and the attorney general if they wanted to, the district attorney. So we made the meetings wide open. And what we did was sit down and try to figure out with that particular child what was in their best interest and where their most appropriate next placement was. Half of the children who were in that residential treatment program left residential treatment back to foster care or a relative. They did not leave that program to go to another residential treatment program. So even though folks were saying or implying or suggesting that the kids in there were really crazy, it turned out that very few of them needed the level of residential treatment that we were paying for with that placement. So the silver lining there was there's plenty of evidence that what explains the bad behavior of children in the child welfare system is their exposure to trauma and instability and not their mental illness. And we can make that case too. So in some respects, even though I'm giving you this really wonkish speech, right, even though I'm throwing a bunch of numbers at you, and I am, in some respects, being a little sarcastic about the way in which we talk about the work that we do and the way others talk about the work that we do, I'm suggesting to you that what we ought to do is to create a new narrative. It ought to be a narrative about what we do well, not what we don't do well. It ought to be a narrative that's about making a meaningful contribution to the society that we work in. It is about building a system that is increasingly more effective, not less. And ultimately, it is a narrative about making a significant difference in the lives of the children and families that need us the most. So, certainly my agenda over the next couple of years is around changing that narrative. I would challenge you as you go through the day, look at your data, talk to the people around you, listen to what they're doing that's making a difference, steal their ideas, right? Go make some new mistakes, not the old ones. Learn from one another. Leverage the data that you're going to find here. Go look at the literature. And get to a place over the next couple of days where you're willing to take one step out of the old narrative and take one step into a new narrative. do all this work, meet all these nice people, and go back to your state believing that you're actually more capable of changing the child welfare system, not less. And probably most important, as you leave here, know that our role as the federal government is to assist you in accomplishing the work that you do and meeting the goals that you set in your state. And you ought to use the federal staff, you ought to use the federal resource centers, you ought to use any of the federal resources we make available to you. You ought to use them first to get better results, and second to tell a different story because you know more. So I know I've given you a little food for thought. And like I said, I've been a little sarcastic. And in some respects, I haven't really gotten the narrative down myself. But I know this. I know that there's truth in the numbers. And the truth in the numbers say, you guys are doing a great job. Your other colleagues in other parts of the child welfare system are getting better at what they do day by day. And you ought to leave Washington, D.C. this week believing that you are a part of something that is getting better and not worse. You are a part of something that you can embrace. And you are a part of something that is making a huge difference in the lives of children and families. So enjoy the rest of the day.